Hi, Florian Birkmayer MD here from AromaGnosis. I wanted to record a short video about how to know that you're actually really working with the unconscious. And I think this is an important topic because I think the ego can easily trick us when we think we're doing work with the unconscious, we're getting interesting information. And I think of the ego sort of like the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain in the movie, saying, "Oh, nothing to see here, folks," but you might still be stuck in the ego. The other reason I think it's important to know when we're working with the unconscious is because of what's called spiritual bypass, which is the idea that, as Jung said, well, he said it in the opposite. He said we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by fearlessly confronting the darkness within. So the figures of light are external teachers, guides, ideas, which keep us astray. And so that's spiritual bypass is always looking for the love and light, usually outside ourselves. Usually there's some new teacher or method that we're fascinated by, and it's a way of avoiding the hard work of looking at all the stuff in our unconscious, which can often be quite challenging, as we're going to talk about. Another term for this work is shadow work. That's getting a lot of traction again, but again, um, I guess the most important thing to say with regards to the shadow and shadow work is a lot of people have this mistaken idea that the shadow is everything we don't like about ourselves, everything negative about ourselves. Now, anything we know about ourselves that we don't like or is negative is not in the shadow by definition. The shadow is literally the part of ourselves we can't see. And that's where the misconception is, because I think for many of us, our greatest gift, our greatest power is hiding in the shadow. Often we project it outwards. So to say the shadow is all the bad things, the things I don't like, is wrong because, again, we don't know it, what's in the shadow, and it can be our greatest gift. So I want to start with a paraphrase. Jung over his house in Switzerland had the quote, "Invited or not, God is present," which is an old Greek quotation. And I want to say, invited or not, the unconscious is present. And people often say, "Oh, what if I make the right choices or the wrong choices, or what's good or bad?" Really, the only thing we have uh, control over, you could say, is whether things are conscious or unconscious. If we pretend the unconscious doesn't exist, then we're completely unconscious of it and it completely rules us. If we allow material and information from the unconscious to rise into consciousness, we can work with it. Now, this requires, of course, the ego sort of to take a more receptive attitude, to be less in the driver's seat, um, and to acknowledge that there's such a thing as the unconscious. There's a funny quote by Jung, you can find it on YouTube, where he says, it's an old film that's been digitized, "The unconscious is hard to understand because we're unconscious of it." Or another way to say that is, the greatest trick the devil ever played on us is convincing us he doesn't exist. And again, I like the idea of convincing us he doesn't exist. However, the devil again has this implication that there's something dark or negative. Again, our greatest gifts can hide in the unconscious, and if we pretend the unconscious isn't always at play, we're going to be ruled by it unconsciously. Now, the other thing I want to mention in this context is the default mode network. I've recorded a few other videos about the default mode network, and in brief, it's the network that was originally discovered in functional MRI scanners when researchers asked people not to do anything in particular, and you'd think if you're asked to not do anything in particular, your brain would kind of go into a low energy state, sort of like the computer falling asleep. But in fact, certain areas of the brain become more active, they light up, and that was discovered as the default mode network. And that's not just there when relying on an fMRI scanner. The other example is if you're driving on a road you've been 100 times, or going to work, going to the store, you get there and you don't even remember how you got there because the default mode network took over. And that's one of the ideas, is that it's there as a sort of energy saving mode in the brain, but it's actually involved in a lot of things. It's involved in all sorts of quick social judgments, like, I think social media, the Facebook like button, tickle the default mode network, or hack it, you could say. And a lot of, as we're discovering more and more severe mental illnesses, PTSD, anxiety, depression, OCD, substance abuse, all seem to be encoded in the default mode network. And the other thing that the default mode network does is it's really our story of ourselves, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, which is really, if you look at it, another definition of the ego. So you could say the ego is just a program running in the default mode network. And the other thing about the ego, we usually, and myself included, we often conflate the ego with consciousness. And the funny thing is, at the same time, a lot of when we're in ego is actually very unconscious. Again, like these quick social judgments on social media, driving to the store, to work. So there's this, in my head, this paradox. There's a contrast between the conscious ego and the unconscious, which makes a lot of sense. But then there's also sort of this paradox that what we think the ego is actually mostly unconscious. It's mostly this automatic program, this sort of rut that we operate in the default mode network. So that's whenever I'm reminded of things or ways in which the ego is unconscious or automatic, uh, it makes me scratch my head. I mean, one example is, where does the ego go when you're asleep? We often think the ego is foundational, but the fact that our ego disappears every night when we go to sleep and then reappears every morning when we wake up, it's not continuous. It's sort of a program that runs a few hours of the day. And the other thing is, another trick the ego plays on us quite unconsciously is to think that we're the same person we were yesterday or a year ago or 10 years ago. Who gives? I mean, none of us are the people we were 10 years ago, and yet the ego creates this illusion of continuity, like the way old movies used to work on the film strip. There were lots of still images, and the projector creates a flicker, and so there's the illusion of continuity, the illusion of movement. So there's this paradox that even though we contrast the ego with unconscious, the ego is actually mostly quite unconscious. And I think that's where paying attention to the default mode network and all these automatic programs running is important. Now, so how can we work with the unconscious? I think Kathy and I have talked about this in other videos. Of course, dreams, as Freud called it, the royal road to the unconscious. Active imagination or daydreaming, I think, is also very good. Now, our big thing is working with aromas because they bypass the intellect. They deactivate the default mode network. They could help us snap out of the default mode network. And they really reconnect us. Elsewhere, I've called them the molecules of connectedness. And I think the ego, one of the fundamental programs is I am me, I am not you, I am separate and distinct, which then means I can make choices, etc., etc. So I think part of the way is aromas bypass the ego or help us achieve a larger perspective, a more door open perspective, is that we become open to the parts of ourselves we're unconscious of, which is most of our psyche, and we also become more deeply connected to the beings, the plants, trees, animals around us. And again, that takes a certain weakening of the ego taking a back seat. Another really good way to access unconscious materials is journaling, and not just sort of, left brain, what did I do today, or here's my to-do list, but really sort of letting the pen lead your hand across the page. And after a while, even if you have conscious content at first, after a while it's an opportunity for the unconscious to slip through. So how do you know that unconscious content is actually coming through? One way that I've seen in myself and in many clients is when the ego barriers come up. So in a way, the instinctual reaction when an ego barrier comes up is to say, oh, that's uncomfortable, I don't want to feel that, let me change directions. And we have to have a certain awareness, a certain self-awareness to say, oh, this is really triggering me. And I'll talk about what the triggers are in a minute. This means this is exactly the direction I need to go. And in a way, the ego is saying, no, don't go there. Don't open that kind of worms. Don't open that door. Don't go down that hallway. And again, when we're in ego, when we're unconscious, it's easy to say, oh, I don't want to feel that. Let me do something else. And then the ego is like, phew, avoided that one. Because the ego, one of its purposes seems to be to maintain the status quo. And when we go in the direction where we open the door to the unconscious, to the soul, the ego is like, no, you don't want to go there. So what are some of these ego barriers? I've actually recorded another video, but a common one is anxiety and fear. This is, I'm uncomfortable, I'm feeling anxious, can't breathe. Anxiety comes in all different ways. We distract ourselves. Oh, I got something really urgent to do. But just pay attention to that anxiety. And instead of saying, oh, I don't like feeling anxious, I don't like feeling fear, let me go do something else. Saying, let me sit with this anxiety, because it's a threshold. And if we sit with it long enough, we'll get over that threshold. The threshold will disappear. Another barrier is the common ego. Oh, this is stupid. Don't waste your time. You got such important other things to do. You got all these urgent things to do. This is stupid. So to recognize when your ego says this is stupid, that's something to pay attention to. The other one is it's too late. I'm too old, or the work required. There's too much work required to go there. Again, I think that they have their own flavor. Often I'll hear, oh, I've lived my life in this ego way for so long. I mean, we wouldn't say that. We'd say this is the only way. Again, we're in the rut of the default mode network. It's too late to change. Um, and I think the other part is, oh, there's so much I have to work on to get to this place, which is a nuance of that. Another ego barrier that I want to emphasize is once we sort of cross some of these other thresholds and we get into it, often the ego will say, well, you're not doing this right. Or people say, oh, I'm not sure I'm doing this right. So I think even once the horse has left the barn, the ego is still trying to say, oh, you're not doing this right, and get the ego back in control. So as I said, all these barriers show when you recognize them, that's exactly the direction you need to go in, instead of unconsciously automatically saying, oh, that's uncomfortable, let me go do something else. And again, the ego is then forced to let go a little bit of control. And I think that's where the resistance comes in, that the ego knows it has control over us. It sort of casts a spell over us. And when we go in those directions, when we try to cross those thresholds, on the other side of which unconscious content is, then the spell of the ego is about to be broken. And again, you can recognize that by the intensity of the ego defenses, the ego barriers that I just described. Now, another thing that I'm continuously surprised by, pun intended, is one way you know that something's from the unconscious if it's really surprising. So whether you're journaling, doing enough active imagination, or daydreaming, even in dreams, in a way, the more odd, the more bizarre, and the more sort of this intense emotion of like, what the bleep, or the ego saying, nah, that's not important. All those sort of aspects of surprisedness, to me, have become a sign, wow, that's really from the unconscious. When the ego's like, wow, I had no idea, or what a strange dream I just had, or in the active imagination, why did this image just pop into my head? Now, another way, I didn't know where to put it, I think this is as good a place as any, is the idea of projection. There used to be this Facebook meme years ago saying 3 signs you're not projecting. Number one, 3 signs you're projecting. Number one, I'm not projecting. So often when we're projecting, and projecting again is, as Jung said, putting our unseen face and aspect of ourselves onto another person, the first ego trick is again to say, well, it's all the other person's fault. They're really annoying. They're a difficult person. I really don't like that quality of them. And the number one question is, what is it triggering in me? So in a way, projection is a great way to encounter the unconscious if we have the wherewithal to say, wait a minute, why is this other person triggering me so much? The other way to encounter the unconscious is synchronicity, is when you see a hawk flying. It's not just, oh, there's a hawk going from point A to point B. It's like, why am I seeing this hawk right now? What's going on? And it's the world that we perceive is really just one channel of this massive collective unconscious. And there's all sorts of what Jung called synchronicities, acausal, correlating events. And I think it's really important to pay attention to those. And again, the ego will say, bah, humbug. But that's in those cracks is where the unconscious comes through. And again, not just the individual unconscious, but the collective also. So as I said, invited or not, the unconscious is present. That's a paraphrase from Jung. And that's what we have to be mindful of. So how to work with it. So we just talked about how can we tell we're heading there or we're there, and then what to do with it. So when images come, dream images, active imagination, journaling, seeing things synchronistically, projecting, no matter how challenging they are to the ego, no matter how unpleasant, no matter what strong negative emotions they evoke, remember they are living images, living messages from the unconscious. So as weird or disturbing as they may seem, they are precious gifts, and treat them accordingly. There's many stories. I keep thinking of stories from Nepal where a wise man or a deity will embody as a beggar or look very ill, and then the king encounters the beggar, and may reject the beggar, and then they miss their opportunity to get a gift. There's stories like that around here with certain energies and spirits in Hawaii. So the gifts may come in a very triggering or unpleasant gift wrap, let's say, but we have to realize this is our unconscious giving us a precious gift. I have many dreams where my first reaction was that was disturbing or bizarre or weird. And then as I elaborate on it, look at the imagery, it's like, oh my God, how precious this is. So that's another thing is don't strangle the images prematurely with premature interpretation. In that sense, I mean, interpretation sort of intellectual saying, oh, this means this. Don't use dream dictionaries, whether it's a dream or an act of imagination or even something that just flows out in your journal. When you say, oh, I dreamt of a black dog and that means X, again, then your intellect's trying to take over. Just the, the Jung's technique was called amplification, where you keep going back to the original images, the original figures in the dream, and keep saying, well, what else could it mean? What else could it mean? What else could it mean? And it doesn't mean there's one right interpretation and the other ones are invalid. In the differences between all the different interpretations, like the blind man and the elephant, a deeper truth emerges. That's really the archetypal truth of the dream image or the image from the unconscious. So again, don't strangle it. Don't prematurely decide, oh, this means that. That's the ego sort of my images. The ego's like, managed to control that one. So just let these images live. I've had dreams for weeks, months later, sometime a long time later, I'll make a drawing or a collage and keep looking at it because it's speaking. My unconscious is saying, oh, he's actually paying attention. And then you get more and you get more. So we already talked about amplification, but even just honoring the image exactly as they are, without interpretation, drawing them, making art, making collage, writing it down is really important in terms of honoring it. Again, paying attention to synchronicities, really, really pay attention. Um, that can't be overstated. It's, a lot of people will censor themselves. And again, the synchronicity is as much about what our unconscious is trying to give to us. It's like, do you see? Do you see? So just be open. I think another aspect is really a trusted community, whether that's one other person or a handful. It's really the power of beholding each other. I always say healing is beholding. If we are beheld in this connection with the unconscious, then, and if we behold someone else, that there's something really deep that happens. Then we really, through by someone else beholding us, we realize we're being beheld, we can behold ourselves. We become aware that this is part of ourselves that is beholding. And I think we really need community. Again, it could be one other person, um, to allow that to say, hey, guess what? I had this crazy dream. And the other person just beholds you in your totality, or vice versa. If someone tells you something, just behold them without judgment, with an open heart. There's that heart-to-heart connection. And in that, that's where the healing happens. The other thing I think in terms of working with the unconscious is really time in nature. Again, really go by yourself. Don't listen to a podcast. Don't distract yourself. Just really immerse yourself in nature, and you'll become aware of that reconnection, that deep connection. And it is, the ego might throw all sorts of barriers. Oh, I better hike X miles, or I have something to do. I only have 20 minutes for this. But really just surrender, reconnect, and you'll see how you people always say, well, there's that quote by John Muir that I can't remember. I went into the wilderness to find myself because I'd lost myself. Um, I really butchered that quote, but we behold ourselves in nature. We are beheld by the plants and animals in nature, and we behold them, and in that reconnection, we behold ourselves. Again, the other big strategy is working with oils. Every day, I have essential oils in my pocket. I have one right here, right now. Constantly work with them. One at a time is fine. As I said, I carried a bottle of sandalwood essential oil with me for many years. It just reconnects you with yourself, as I said. It reconnects you with what's important, what's the unconscious asking me to pay attention to. this video was really inspired by. I went to the dump, and in the dump I had this idea. So, the magic is everywhere. And instead of saying, "Oh, that's a stupid idea," I got on the way to the dump. I was like, "No, this is the unconscious saying this needs to be expressed right now." And with that, again, the other way to really work with the unconscious is, above all, commit to your own wounded healer's journey. It doesn't mean you have to be a healer professionally. That's a whole archetype that should be deconstructed. But we're all wounded healers on our journey. As Marie-Louise von Franz said, the wounded healer is the archetype of the self. That journey of becoming is constantly examining ourselves, constantly, as Jung said, not seeking figures of light outside ourselves, but looking at the darkness inside, the shadow inside. So I hope that this was useful. Maybe let me know in the comments. If you haven't, subscribe to our channel and our newsletter, and we'll see you soon.